Let me be very clear. What you are witnessing right now is not just another exchange. It is Iran demonstrating with cold precision that it possesses the capacity and the will to strike back on a scale that changes the entire strategic equation in the Middle East. A calculated assertion of sovereignty that echoes through the corridors of power from Washington to Tel Aviv and beyond, reminding us all that assumptions of unchallenged dominance in the region have always been more fragile than the architects of policy care to admit. 300 Shahab-3s launched in waves at enemy positions, and the U.S. alliance is already reeling, its layered defenses tested in ways that expose the limits of technological superiority when confronted with sheer volume, dispersed logistics, and a doctrine forged in the fires of decades of sanctions, isolation, and existential pressure. This barrage, unfolding in coordinated salvos just days after the February 28, 2026 U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear and missile facilities, represents not some impulsive outburst, but a deliberate, measured retaliation that has already overwhelmed the most sophisticated air defense networks the alliance could muster, leaving initial reports filtering in of significant penetration into Israeli military positions, airfields, ports, including the critical logistics hub at Haifa, and forward operating sites near Dimona and Beersheba, where the full scope of disruption is only now becoming clear amid the stunned silence emanating from both Washington and Tel Aviv. These Shahab-3 medium-range ballistic missiles, each boasting an operational range of approximately 1,300 kilometers and capable of delivering payloads between 750 and 1,200 kilograms, were fired from road-mobile launchers that had survived the earlier bombing campaigns precisely because of Iran's long-standing emphasis on mobility, concealment, and redundancy within its estimated arsenal of some 2,500 missiles, many of them liquid-fueled, yet integrated into a dispersed network of underground facilities and mountain redoubts that prior intelligence assessments had grossly underestimated. This single-type salvo dwarfs even the April 2024 barrage of roughly 120 ballistic missiles, marking the largest such operation ever recorded from Tehran, and serving as a stark indicator that the Islamic Republic's strategic patience, honed through months of absorbing renewed sanctions, targeted assassinations, and proxy pressures, has now given way to a calibrated response, designed not for spectacle, but for systemic impact, with early indicators already pointing to Israeli and American interceptors being exhausted or bypassed in the face of saturation tactics that left alliance air defenses reporting overload across multiple sectors. Stay with me, because the numbers alone do not tell the full story. What we are seeing is the culmination of years of quiet doctrinal evolution, where Iran has transformed vulnerability into a weaponized resilience that forces every policymaker in the region to recalibrate their assumptions about escalation ladders and deterrence thresholds. Having been inside the system, I can tell you this kind of miscalculation has been warned about for years, yet it was ignored, buried beneath layers of optimistic briefings and ideological certainties that prioritized regime change rhetoric over the cold realities of geography, history, and asymmetric capabilities. Let us move now into the broader context, because this is not an unprovoked act, but the direct consequence of the Trump administration's miscalculation in greenlighting those February 28 strikes, actions framed publicly as necessary to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions and cripple its missile programs, but which, in the private assessments I have long observed, amounted to a high-stakes gamble aimed at sparking internal upheaval and reshaping the Middle East on terms favorable to a narrow set of allies. Iran's strategic patience in the intervening months, absorbing wave after wave of economic strangulation, covert operations, and the bolstering of proxy forces along multiple fronts, was never weakness, but preparation, a deliberate holding of fire until the moment when retaliation could be delivered with maximum strategic effect. exposing the fragility of the U.S.-Israel Gulf security architecture in ways that no amount of post-strike triumphalism could obscure. The thesis here is unmistakable. Iran has seized the initiative, dictating the tempo of conflict and forcing the alliance into a defensive crouch it cannot sustain indefinitely, a position that underscores how this barrage is qualitatively different from anything that has come before. Not the random harassment of unguided rockets from non-state actors, but a sophisticated saturation attack employing precision-guided variants, decoys, and timed waves engineered to exhaust radar tracking systems, deplete interceptor stockpiles, and penetrate even the most advanced terminal phase defenses like Arrow-3, THAAD, and Patriot batteries. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and the patterns are all too familiar. What the administration bet on was a weakened adversary, its missile cities supposedly shattered, and its command nodes fragmented. Yet the bulk of Iran's arsenal remained intact beneath layers of hardened underground facilities and mobile dispersal tactics that rendered satellite surveillance and precision bombing far less decisive than the public narrative suggested. Alliance partners such as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are already signaling through back-channel diplomatic murmurs and public statements laced with caution their reluctance to participate in any follow-on operations. A hesitation born not of sudden affection for Tehran, but of hard-headed calculations about the costs of entanglement in a conflict whose outcomes now appear far less certain than they did even weeks ago. The math is brutal, and it is entirely on Iran's side, a reality that emerges with stark clarity when one examines the operational brilliance of this barrage in detail. Consider the technical and logistical execution. Multiple launch waves deliberately spaced to overwhelm radar horizons and tracking algorithms, incorporating decoy warheads and electronic countermeasures that complicated interception at every phase, from boost to terminal descent. While the rapid dispersal and reload of those road-mobile launchers under constant satellite scrutiny represented a feat of command and control resilience that few outside the intelligence community fully appreciated until now. Target selection was no accident either. Priority fell on IDF air bases critical to long-range strike capabilities, command nodes that coordinate joint operations with Washington, the port logistics at Haifa essential for resupply and reinforcement, and sites supporting Israeli infrastructure near Dimona and Beersheba, all of which demonstrate upgrades in Iranian intelligence gathering, guidance systems, and real-time battle damage assessment that have evolved far beyond the crude platforms of earlier decades. Even under conservative estimates of a 65% interception rate, itself an optimistic figure given the saturation dynamics at play, that leaves approximately 105 warheads impacting with devastating effect, enough to cripple key infrastructure, disrupt operational tempo, and impose repair timelines measured in weeks or months rather than days, a level of penetration that exceeds the partial successes observed in April 2024, when far fewer missiles were employed. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and this is textbook saturation warfare executed at the highest level, where the cost asymmetry alone renders sustained defense economically unsustainable for the alliance. Each Shahab-3 comes at a rough price tag for Iran of between $500,000 and $1 million, while comparable interceptors from the Arrow-3, THAAD, or Patriot families run anywhere from $2 million to $4 million apiece, meaning that Tehran can impose prohibitive expenses on its adversaries with every salvo, while preserving the bulk of its inventory for future contingencies. This doctrine of strategic depth, relying on sheer volume to guarantee hits, even if 60 to 70% of the missiles are neutralized, draws from historical precedents of attrition warfare, where determined lesser powers eroded the will and resources of technologically superior foes. Yet it has been modernized here with high-tech elements that make it uniquely potent in the missile age. But if you think that's the full story, it's not, because the cascading failures now visible in the U.S.-Israel alliance reveal deeper structural vulnerabilities that no amount of immediate resupply can fully paper over. What comes next is where things take a serious turn for the U.S. alliance, as delayed or inadequate American resupply of interceptors strains existing stockpiles already depleted by the February engagements, while internal Israeli political recriminations erupt in the Knesset and across media outlets, with coalition partners questioning the wisdom of the initial strikes and opposition voices demanding accountability for intelligence lapses that left the country exposed. Trump's public statements, laced with the familiar rhetoric of strength and victory, stand in sharp contrast to the reality on the ground, where the administration's assumption that Iran had been decisively weakened has been refuted not just by the scale of this response, but by the speed and coordination with which it was delivered, exposing a gap between policy pronouncements and operational facts that senior officials in the Pentagon and State Department are now scrambling to reconcile in emergency sessions. Gulf states, long positioned as quiet partners in the anti-Iran containment strategy, are quietly distancing themselves from further entanglement, their leaders privately conveying alarm over the potential for wider regional spillover that could threaten energy exports and domestic stability in ways that unconditional alignment with Washington no longer guarantees. The diplomatic fallout is already rippling outward, with European allies expressing private alarm at the pace of escalation and the risks to global energy markets, while China and Russia extend quiet diplomatic cover to Iran through statements emphasizing restraint and multilateral dialogue. Moves that subtly shift the balance of international legitimacy and complicate any unified alliance response. U.S. carrier groups in the region, once poised for offensive projection, are now repositioning defensively to safeguard their own assets amid heightened alert levels, a posture that speaks volumes about the limits of power projection when confronted with credible ballistic threats. Economic indicators underscore the pressure. Reports of an immediate 8 to 12% spike in Brent crude futures reflect market anxieties over potential disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, where Iranian naval and missile assets could impose further costs if the conflict widens, threatening supply chains already strained by global uncertainties, and reminding investors that military posturing carries tangible price tags far beyond the battlefield. This next part changes everything, because the deeper strategic implication of this barrage is that Iran has not only survived the initial U.S.-Israeli assault, but has leveraged it to demonstrate a credible second strike capability that fundamentally deters future aggression, shifting the regional power balance in a manner that few in the Western intelligence community had game planned with sufficient seriousness. The intelligence failure here runs deep. U.S. and Israeli assessments consistently underestimated both the survivability of Iran's mobile missile force, those road mobile platforms that proved far harder to neutralize than fixed sites, and the resilience of its command and control infrastructure, which maintained operational cohesion even under the pressure of precision strikes aimed at decapitation. Iran retains the vast majority of its approximately 2,500 missile inventory after this salvo, positioning it for potential follow-on barrages if provoked further. A reality that echoes historical parallels, such as the North Vietnamese use of saturation tactics and human wave resilience to erode American will in Vietnam, albeit executed here on a modern, high-tech scale, where missiles replace infantry and precision guidance substitutes for massed formations. Let me be very clear once more. The United States and Israel are now operating from a position of strategic weakness they have not faced in decades, a position born of long-term policy errors that prioritized endless maximum pressure campaigns over pragmatic engagement, ultimately strengthening rather than diminishing Iran's asymmetric toolkit and its alliances with non-state actors across the region. This single operation has forced Israel into a defensive posture that limits its capacity for follow-on strikes, compelling a reevaluation of timelines and resources that were once taken for granted. While in Washington, the calls for diplomatic off-ramps grow louder amid internal debates that pit ideological hardliners against those attuned to the mounting political and economic costs. The window for de-escalation is narrowing, yet the facts on the ground have changed irrevocably, demanding a recognition that military superiority on paper does not translate into strategic dominance when confronted with determined, adaptive, asymmetric warfare rooted in national survival and historical grievance. The strategic outlook is now unmistakably clear, and it does not favor those who miscalculated Iran's resolve, as projected economic and political costs to both Israel and the United States mount over the coming 6 to 12 months in the form of heightened defense expenditures, disrupted trade routes, and domestic political fallout that could destabilize coalitions already strained by domestic priorities. Iran's demonstrated ability to sustain operations while under pressure, drawing on its deep strategic depth and diversified partnerships, suggests a capacity for prolonged engagement that the alliance, divided as it now appears, may find difficult to match without broader international buy-in that is increasingly elusive. Having been inside the system, I can assure you that this is the moment when empires begin to rethink their assumptions, when the allure of decisive military solutions gives way to the sobering arithmetic of deterrence and the need for diplomatic realism in a multipolar world where no single actor holds all the cards. This is Lawrence Wilkerson, and I will continue to bring you the unvarnished truth from inside the system. Hit that subscribe button. Leave your thoughts below on what the U.S. should do next and whether the Trump administration will adjust course in light of these developments. And I will see you in the next update, because the situation is evolving by the hour. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember, the math is never wrong, but policymakers often are.